Hey there! Welcome back to another episode of Critically Speaking. Today we'll be taking a look at the national debt ceiling and its impact on the U.S. as a whole. The national debt ceiling is the maximum amount of money that the United States government can borrow to fund its operations and pay its debts. When the debt ceiling is reached, Congress must raise it in order for the government to continue borrowing and operating. The national debt ceiling can have several effects on Americans, including an impact on government operations, an impact on the economy, and an impact on individuals. If Congress does not raise the debt ceiling, the government may not have enough money to pay its bills and operate, potentially leading to a government shutdown. Failure to raise the debt ceiling can cause uncertainty and instability in financial markets, potentially leading to higher interest rates, inflation, and decreased economic growth. The debt ceiling can also have an impact on individual Americans, as it can lead to cuts in government services and programs, such as Social Security and Medicare, and potentially higher taxes. To be clear, the debt limit does not give permission for new spending commitments. Rather, it enables the government to fund existing legal obligations that were made by past Congresses and presidents from both parties. Let's see if we can take a closer look at the effects of the national debt ceiling, why we keep hitting the ceiling, and what we might consider doing to avoid reaching the ceiling in the future. Let's get critical. The national debt refers to the cumulative amount of money borrowed by the U.S. federal government throughout its history. Whenever the government's ongoing expenses exceeds its revenues, it relies on borrowing to cover the shortfall. To facilitate this, the U.S. Treasury Department issues and sells securities which represent the debt owed by the government. These securities come in different forms, with bills, notes, and bonds being the most common. Their variations lie in the duration until maturity, ranging from a few days to as long as 30 years, as well as the interest rates they offer. Since 2001, the United States has consistently incurred annual deficits, necessitating borrowing to sustain its operations each year. And as most know, 2001 was a pivotal year for the U.S. Once the debt ceiling is reached, the U.S. federal government is unable to increase its outstanding debt. It must rely on existing cash reserves and incoming revenues to meet its financial obligations. To prolong the government's ability to fulfill its obligations while staying within the limit, the U.S. Treasury employs certain extraordinary measures. These measures involve accounting techniques that temporarily reduce the amount of U.S. Treasury securities issued to specific government accounts. They may include suspending new investments or redeeming existing investments ahead of schedule. By decreasing the outstanding Treasury securities, the overall debt level momentarily decreases, providing a slight extension to the time frame in which the government can meet its obligations. If the U.S. Treasury exhausts its cash reserves and the extraordinary measures, the federal government loses the means to pay its bills and finance its operations beyond the incoming revenues, which typically covers about 80% of the required amount. Although the United States has encountered debt limit situations in the past, it has never completely depleted its resources and failed to meet its financial commitments. Examples include the debt ceiling crisis in 2011 and 2013, where the debt limit was either raised, with Congress increasing the cap by a specific dollar amount, or suspended, with Congress eliminating the debt limit for a designated period, before the U.S. Treasury ran out of cash and utilized all extraordinary measures. The biggest and most prevalent issue regarding the debt ceiling lies in the risk of default. If the debt ceiling is not raised in a timely manner, the government may not have enough funds to meet all its financial obligations, such as paying government employees, servicing existing debts, and funding essential programs. This could potentially lead to a default on the country's financial commitments, which would have severe consequences for the economy and financial markets. In 2011, the United States faced a significant debt ceiling crisis. The government reached its borrowing limit, and negotiations between Congress and the Obama administration over raising the debt ceiling became contentious. The situation led to concerns that the government might default on its debt obligations. But eventually, an agreement was reached and the debt ceiling was raised, avoiding a default. According to a CNN report, the Joint Committee in 2011 was tasked with finding additional deficit reduction measures to offset a $1.2 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. The committee failed and thus triggered the spending caps known as sequestration. Ultimately, approximately $1.5 trillion of the agreed $2.1 trillion in spending was reduced, with $855 billion in cuts allocated to discretionary spending over the course of a decade. These cuts impacted various agencies and programs such as defense, education, justice, and the Internal Revenue Service. Additionally, the deal included a 2% reduction in payments to Medicare providers as part of the cuts to mandatory spending programs. Moving ahead to 2023, a significant obstacle in resolving the deadlock over the debt ceiling revolved around the extent of spending reductions. The Biden administration expressed hesitation about reverting spending levels back to those seen in fiscal 22, a provision included by Republicans in their debt ceiling bill earlier this year. Meanwhile, Kevin McCarthy's team remains steadfast in their position. The recently announced agreement entails reducing non-defense discretionary spending for fiscal year 2024. However, through specific agreed-upon appropriation adjustments, nearly all of the discrepancies would be compensated. As a result, non-defense spending would experience a mere 1% increase in fiscal year 2025. As mentioned previously, in the event that the U.S. federal government depletes its available resources, it would face a shortfall in funds required to satisfy various payments. These payments encompass essential social programs that provide support to households, including Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance. They also cover crucial government functions such as national defense and transportation. Unfortunately, everyday households would encounter various repercussions as well. ranging from the absence of crucial social program payments like Social Security or housing assistance to facing elevated interest rates on mortgages and credit card debt. The consequences of a default would reverberate across the entire nation. In the event of a U.S. default, a substantial number of individuals, including families with children, retirees, and veterans, would swiftly face the risk of losing the essential regular federal payments that play a vital role in meeting their basic needs. These potential disruptions could occur rapidly, with some experiencing them overnight. In 2020, nearly 50 million individuals received retirement benefits through Social Security, while 6 million received survivors' benefits. Back in 2015, approximately 12 million people relied solely on Social Security as their primary source of support. The average retired Social Security beneficiary anticipated receiving an approximate monthly payment of $1,600. For households receiving any Social Security benefits, these payments constituted over half of their total income on average. However, in the event of a default, these individuals may face delayed or even non-existent Social Security payments. The availability of healthcare coverage, especially during a pandemic, would also be cast into doubt. More than 60 million Americans rely on Medicare, while 75 million are enrolled in Medicaid, and almost 7 million children benefit from the Children's Health Insurance Program. The average net Medicare payment amounts to around $1,100 per recipient. Despite the critical need for affordable healthcare, countless individuals can find themselves without coverage if a default were to occur. Veteran programs would also be at risk in the face of a default, impacting over 9 million veterans who rely on physical and mental health care services, among other forms of support. A single veteran with a 50% disability rating and no dependents, for instance, receives an average monthly disability benefit of approximately $900. Veterans with families or higher disability ratings receive greater support. There are numerous services that rely on federal support, which many Americans may not fully recognize. If a default were to occur, the National Weather Service might encounter challenges in delivering essential weather information to families, local news stations, and businesses. The functioning of the radio telecommunications system, overseen by the Federal Communications Commission, could be compromised, impacting people's ability to listen to broadcasts and communicate via radio. Additionally, the accurate maintenance of the official time of the United States by the National Institute of Standards and Technology becomes crucial for various aspects of computing and travel, as GPS devices rely on precise official clocks. The consequences of a default extend well beyond the absence of financial assistance for those in need. Everyday services that are vital for a well-functioning society, often operating inconspicuously in the background of our lives, would be jeopardized. The inability to fund these services would lead to significant disruptions throughout the entire country. If the federal government were to miss or delay payments, millions of individuals would struggle to afford basic necessities such as food and rent. The early hardships witnessed during the initial stages of the pandemic, such as families going hungry and waiting in food lines, serve as a stark reminder of the immense suffering caused by insufficient federal support in the aftermath of an economic shock. Lastly, a default, or even the mere threat of one, would have a devastating impact on our economy. In the lead-up to and aftermath of the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, which fortunately avoided a default, market risk indicators experienced a persistent rise while measures of consumer confidence and small business optimism weakened. Following the crisis, mortgage rates saw an increase of approximately 0.7 to 0.8 percentage points for 2 months and only gradually declined thereafter. For a family taking out a $250,000 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, this additional 0.8 percentage point translated to over $30,000 in extra interest payments over the life of the loan. Rates for the consumer financial products, such as auto loans and personal loans, also rose in the aftermath of the 2011 crisis, and these elevated rates often persisted for several months. It is important to note that these effects occurred despite Congress taking action to avoid default in a timely manner, before the U.S. Treasury exhausted its available cash and alternative financing options. While past experience provides some insight into the potential consequences if the federal government fails to meet its obligations, they likely underestimate the magnitude of the challenges the United States would face. An actual default, even if swiftly resolved, would very likely have even more significant effects and result in deeper financial damage. If the United States were to default on its obligations, the consequences would rapidly and significantly escalate. Due to the lack of prior default experience, the exact time frame and extent of these impacts remain uncertain. Moreover, the repercussions would extend beyond the borders of the United States, affecting the global economy, which heavily relies on a strong U.S. economy. The U.S. Treasury debt serves as the benchmark safe asset worldwide, and its interest rates form the foundation for pricing numerous financial products and transactions globally. Additionally, the U.S. dollar is the primary reserve currency worldwide. A default would trigger severe shockwaves in global financial markets, potentially causing credit markets to freeze and stock markets to plummet. This would likely result in widespread layoffs by employers worldwide. The 2008 financial crisis had profound ripple effects that reverberated back to the United States, leading to job cuts and reduced private investment. A default-driven financial crisis could be even more devastating, especially considering the global economy's ongoing recovery from the pandemic. Within the United States, previous simulations conducted by the Federal Reserve and the Peterson Foundation examined the potential consequences of a month-long default in 2013. These simulations suggested a significant increase in unemployment that would persist for at least 2 to 4 years afterward. A recent report by Moody presents even graver projections, indicating that a prolonged 4-month default could lead to a 4% decline in real GDP, unemployment rates nearing 9%, and a loss of nearly 6 million jobs. To provide context, during the 2 years of the Great Recession, real GDP fell by 4.3%, unemployment rose to 10% and almost 9 million jobs were lost. Adding to the impact of a default is the fact that the federal government would be immobilized in responding to the resulting economic crisis, which the default would likely trigger. It would be unable to implement vital relief measures similar to those employed during past economic downturns, including the recent coronavirus pandemic. Consequently, the federal government would be rendered helpless in addressing the ensuing economic turmoil. If the Treasury Department utilizes all available extraordinary measures and cash, the government would be left with the sole option of using incoming revenues to fulfill its obligations. Meeting these obligations would depend on whether the incoming revenues are sufficient to cover the promised payments. However, several factors complicate this hypothetical scenario. Firstly, the decisions regarding spending and revenue allocations were made in previous legislation enacted by Congress and presidents from various political parties. These past decisions determine the current balance between revenues and spending. For example, if the government has committed to paying $10 but only has $6 in revenue, an additional $4 of promised payments cannot be fulfilled unless additional debt is incurred to cover the shortfall. These promised payments could encompass programs such as Social Security and national defense spending. Furthermore, timing discrepancies between spending and revenues create a broader challenge where revenues may not adequately cover spending obligations. Certain weeks and months present greater difficulty for the federal government to meet its obligations compared to others. Both federal spending and revenues exhibit significant seasonal fluctuations, varying widely depending on the time of year, and often lack alignment. Notably, in October, the expected month of resource exhaustion, revenues tend to be lower than in other months, while federal spending exhibits variability. Consequently, the federal government may face increased challenges in satisfying its obligations during this period. As a result, the federal government would have limited incoming funds available to satisfy crucial payments that people depend on. For example, in October 2019, the government's gross receipts amounted to $261 billion, while the spending reached $380 billion. This indicates that if the government's resources were depleted during that month, a significant portion of the promised government expenditures would have remained unpaid. The government, however, can use several tactics to reduce the debt. Consider the case of government debt issuance. Governments commonly issue bonds as a means of borrowing money. This strategy allows them to avoid raising taxes, obtain funds for expenditures, and stimulate the economy through public spending. Theoretically, this stimulates business growth and boosts tax revenue from prosperous businesses and taxpayers. While issuing debt may appear to be a logical approach, it is important to remember that the government is obligated to pay interest to its creditors, and eventually the borrowed funds must be repaid. Throughout history, issuing debt has contributed to economic growth in various countries. However, it hasn't proven particularly effective in directly reducing long-term government debt. During times of economic hardship, such as periods of high unemployment, governments may employ additional measures to stimulate the economy. One such method involves purchasing the very bonds they have issued. For instance, the U.S. Federal Reserve implemented quantitative easing on multiple occasions since November 2008. This involved buying substantial quantities of government bonds and other financial securities to spur economic growth and facilitate recovery from the 2007-2008 financial crisis. In the short term, a quantitative easing approach is often favored by numerous financial experts. However, when considering the long-term perspective, the practice of purchasing one's own debt has not demonstrated any greater effectiveness than the strategy of borrowing through bond issuance as a means to achieve economic prosperity. Another tactic would be an interest rate manipulation. Governments employ the strategy of manipulating low interest rates as another method to stimulate economic growth, generate tax income, and ultimately reduce the national debt. By keeping interest rates low, it becomes more convenient for individuals and businesses to borrow money, which in turn promotes spending on goods and services, leading to job creation and increased tax revenues. Countries such as the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom have implemented low interest rate policies during times of economic challenges, yielding some degree of success. However, it should be acknowledged that prolonged periods of near-zero interest rates have not proven to be a magical solution for governments burdened by debt. In the late 1990s, Sweden managed to achieve a balanced budget after facing significant financial challenges in 1994. This accomplishment was accomplished through a combination of measures including spending cuts and tax increases. Similarly, the United States experienced reductions in its debt during certain years such as 1947, 1948, and 1951 under President Harry Truman, as well as in 1956 and 1957 under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In both cases, a combination of spending cuts and tax increases played a role in achieving these debt reductions. Another approach that nations can take to alleviate their debt burdens is by adopting a pro-business and pro-trade stance. Saudi Arabia, for instance, successfully reduced its debt-to-GDP ratio from 80% in 2003 to just 10.2% in 2010 through the sale of oil, capitalizing on its oil reserves in the global energy market. And finally, the last-ditch effort in the form of a national debt bailout. The strategy of seeking debt forgiveness or financial assistance from wealthy nations has been utilized on numerous occasions. Several African nations, for instance, have benefited from debt forgiveness initiatives. However, this approach is not without its drawbacks. An example of debt forgiveness's limitations can be seen in the case of Ghana. In the late 1980s, the country experienced a significant reduction in its debt burden through debt forgiveness. However, by 2011, Ghana found itself once again deeply indebted. Similarly, Greece, despite receiving billions of dollars in bailout funds during the 2010-2011 period, continued to face significant financial challenges. It is worth noting that the United States has a history of providing bailouts dating back to as early as 1792. Another strategy employed for debt reduction is simply defaulting on national debt, which may involve declaring bankruptcy or restructuring debt payments to creditors. This strategy has been successfully utilized by countries such as North Korea, Russia, and Argentina. However, a downside to this approach is that it becomes more difficult and costly for countries to secure future borrowing opportunities after defaulting on their debts. But what do you think? Are we being honest and pragmatic when it comes to cost cutting, taxes, and interest rate manipulation, and other forms of money saving? Many would consider the amount of money spent on social programs a huge expenditure of funds, where others may feel the defense budget goes unchecked and continues to get increased budget approvals with little to no oversight. Maybe there's a happy medium, willing to seed certain government programs in conjunction with a decreased defense budget. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Critically Speaking. Stay positive, stay mindful, and stay critical. That's it for today's episode of Critically Speaking. Thanks for joining us as we explore the latest movies, games, and hot topics. Stay up to date with our latest content by hitting that notification bell. And if you enjoyed the show, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And as always, stay critical.